Okay, thank you for that introduction, which I had nothing to do with. The parts I suggested were left out. So let me see if I can galvanize you. I'm going to try and talk about something that you may well find familiar: race and racism. And I'm going to try and unhinge you from that familiarity. I have a problem with the concept of racism. And I'm going to try and make an argument which suggests that you should have a problem with that concept too. And I don't want to be misread in such a way as to suggest that somehow I'm saying that race isn't an issue or a problem. Race is an issue and a problem. I have a concept called Raceocracy, which suggests that the concept of racism is a problem. So what my argument is going to try to do today is to carve out a path towards problematizing racism as a concept, and in some way suggest that those of us who are fixated by that have been duped. Now, the only reason I've sort of set things up in that kind of way is to be controversial, to get you all against me. And then win you over, slowly, hypnotically. So let's see if we can begin this. Racism isn't as transparent an idea as we think it is. It's often rendered empirically, as if it can describe self-evident conflicts, for example, between ethnic groups, social discrimination. If you look at the literature in recent years, a number of scholars say that racism as a concept has lost its precision. Other scholars say racism as a concept has been inflated. So you have, on the one hand, racism being suggested as something that is becoming a little vague, and then on the other hand, racism is being suggested as something which is becoming a catch-all, describing everything. Now, I don't particularly feel persuaded by those arguments because I think that racism as a concept retains its precision, and it hasn't been conceptually inflated. Because what racism as a concept has always done since its inauguration in the 20th century has been principally to give us a Eurocentric orientation to how we challenge and indict race. And that's been unwavering, that's been consistent, and that's been steadfast in conceptual development. So let me try and develop that first argument and see where we go. George Fredrickson is an American historian who's written a number of things about the history of racism, comparative racisms, particularly looking at segregation and apartheid. And I choose him as a way of beginning to show up this argument that I'm trying to make. It's because Fredrickson is one of those rare people among scholars who's written about racism as a concept. I'm thinking principally of his book, Racism, A Short Introduction, published in 2001. And in the appendix of that book, there is a section entitled Racism in Historical Discourse. He's looking at racism as a concept. How did it arise as an idea? When? Why? How was it deployed? And in its deployment, with what effect and with what features? Now, you probably recognize that in my simply describing that, in many respects, I'm pointing out things that we often don't think about when we look at racism as a concept. We tend to treat it as an empirical object that has to then be conceptualized. But it's always already, even in its empirical ladenness, conceptualized. It's already the product of a conceptual development. So what does that look like historically? But what's also interesting about Fredrickson is that he offers us something of a confessional about his way of using racism as a concept. It's an ambiguously loaded term, he tells us. He also tells us that in his previous work, for a while he decided not to use racism as a term. He felt that it tended to look at one kind of discrimination, what he calls the color-coded variety. And it completely silenced another kind of racism, anti-Semitism. So he, at that point, tended to use white supremacy and anti-Semitism as two discourses to talk about, quote-unquote, racism. And then he came to the conclusion that even though he was trying to straddle these two, quote-unquote, racisms, perhaps he was conceptually privileging one over the other. He thought he was conceptually privileging white supremacy over anti-Semitism. So let me say something about what it would mean to conceptually privilege something. It would mean that we're trying to talk about racism that operates in more than one context, and we take anti-Semitism, white supremacy as the model, as the template on which we base other kinds of racism, conceptual privilege. Now, in looking at this analysis from Fredrickson, the questions that occurred to me is that this notion of conceptual privilege is a very important insight. But what if Fredrickson is wrong about what he actually conceptually privileged? And what if one cannot resolve the problem of conceptual privilege in the concept of racism? So what I'm trying to get at in these questions is that clearly, if it is the case that a particular kind of experience or a particular kind of logic is privileged in what we call racism, what if the privilege goes in a very different direction than Fredrickson thinks it does? So let's remind ourselves what's in this notion of the logic of racism. In that logic is this idea that there is a hierarchy between different ethnic groups. There's a them and an us. There's a positing of an incommensurable barrier between these groups. And there is an exercise of power of one over the other so that the group over whom power is exercised is experiencing discrimination, exclusion, and so on. The question is, how do we arrive at those particular descriptive features? What kind of history or histories do they emerge from in terms of the conceptualization? So what Fredrickson does in order to try and resolve his problem is to posit this idea of overtly racist regimes. For Fredrickson, overtly racist regimes can be illustrated with respect to three specifically destructive and unique conjunctures. The first is Jim Crow, the second is Nazi Germany, and the third is South African apartheid. And that sequence isn't in terms of priority order. And overtly racist regimes exhibit the following kinds of qualities. Firstly, there's an official ideology that is racist. Secondly, there is legislation that enforces racist principles. Thirdly, there is racial segregation, which is mandated by law. Fourthly, there is the exclusion of the racially proscribed from the democratic franchise. And fifthly, there is limited access to the racially prescribed to resources and economic opportunities. Now that sounds like racism to all of us. But why does it sound like racism? What kind of conceptual inheritance do you already possess that enables you to give recognition to that description? What history does that come from? And it's interesting when you analyze and you look closely into what Fredrickson means by overtly racist regimes, it seems to resemble something with which we're all familiar. It's almost as if the template for overtly racist regimes is Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is the place where, in the Western lexicon of political discourse, within the Western complex of political institutions, Nazi Germany is a place where race is put into question in a global way. It becomes feasible and legitimate to campaign around the problematization of race within Western discourse. It's in the aftermath of the problematization of race in relation to Nazi Germany and the Holocaust that Jim Crow, by analogy and comparison, South Africa, apartheid by analogy and comparison, acquires the status, the Western accredited status, of a problem that is now officially problematic. So, in effect, what I'm arguing is that the familiarity that we all possess about those features of racism come from the accreditation which is absorbed by regimes which can be, through analogy, compared to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is the template. Now, I can say a lot more about that in question and answers, but I need to put that out there as the first proposition. In the concept of racism, it's the experience historically of Nazi Germany in terms of its legislation, in terms of its exclusions, in terms of its polity which mandates race as a legislative principle. It's Nazi Germany which is conceptually privileged. Now, think about the consequences of that. If those experiences, and let's just boil it down to one thing, which create a concept of racism which is structured principally around the idea of ideology, and think about how many critiques of racism are critiques of ideology. Politics mobilized by ideas. Legislation informed by racist ideas. If the template is Nazi Germany, and that template creates a conceptual privileging of ideology as the object of critique, then if there are other ways in which race operates as what I would like to describe governance, they're going to be eclipsed by that conceptual privilege. And at the same time, one might figure out that there are particular problems with problematizing racism in this way, because the capacity to problematize and critique and indict race in other ways is simply foreclosed. So this is the argument that I want you to consider. What if there are other ways of foreclosing race? And what would that look like? Now, I don't want to suggest that these other ways are sort of unlimited, pluralistic set of accounts that we can look at. In my view, it's heavily circumscribed. And I'd like to circumscribe it in this particular way before I look at these other ways. Towards the end of the talk, I'm going to say more about this notion of the state of exception and why I've used this idea. But let's imagine that racism, since it's been proscribed and pathologized within liberal democracies, would currently pass for and meet the criteria of a state of exception. So if you had an overtly racist regime coming into operation, one of the things that it might meet in terms of its criteria would be the criteria laid down by Carl Schmitt, and this idea of a state of exception emerges at that point when the rule of law is suspended and a state of emergency or a state of martial law is declared, And it's not so much the rule of law that is in charge, but the law of rule which is in charge. Now, to import an overtly racist regime into a liberal democracy right now would create a racial state of exception. And it seems to me that with the notion of racism and the way in which it's proscribed, at least formally within liberal democracies, it's gained the status of a potential state of exception. Okay? Almost as if it's an interruption of a liberal democratic regime. Now, if that's the case, that will make it very difficult for any arguments that suggest race isn't an interruption of a liberal democratic regime, but rather it's constitutive. That would be foreclosed from the outset. And I'm suggesting that's been foreclosed. So how would we open up the door to gain entry to that particular idea? This is where I want to introduce you to the accidental concept of raceocracy. Do you know, for the last 5 minutes, a bottle of water's been in my head, and I've been imagining myself drinking it, and it's just not been there, you know, and I've been just carrying on regardless. But anyway, I had to share that with you. There's no easy way of saying it. So I want to describe this, what I call this accidental concept of raceocracy. And as I describe it, let's see what it does and let's see what you think. In a way, we might want to argue that it's not so much an alternative to the concept of racism, although in a way it is, but a supplement to the concept of racism. A supplement in a very precise sense. A supplement in the Derridian sense of shoring up some deficiencies, apparently so, in the concept of racism, and a supplement in the sense that the concept of racism cannot do or cannot survive without the concept of raceocracy. And if we go that far, we might say, why do we need the concept of racism anyway? Let's just deal with raceocracy. Maybe that's what we're looking at. So that's the direction of the argument. In June 1915, the World Peace Foundation, a now defunct group, sponsored a conference on international relations at Cornell University. And they published the proceedings the following year. Now, as you can probably expect, many of the papers dealt with the First World War and questions of peace, including militarization, international law, democracy, the idea of a Western peace agenda. But there was one paper in that collection of proceedings that particularly stood out. Stood out because no other paper was dealing with the issues that it dealt with. And in many respects, it mediated all of these Western issues and condensed them into one specific focus, which it entitled, thank you, that's okay, the papers will dry off, condensed them into one specific focus: America's Asiatic problem. The author of this paper was Sidney L. Gulick. Now, Sidney L. Gulick, who authored this paper, America's Asiatic Problem, had authored many books about Japanese culture. He authored a book in 1905 called The White Peril, trying to suggest that the colonization of Asia by, America and Europe, their interventions, formed a white peril. He was trying to put the other side. And in this paper, what was interesting, Gulick, was that the whole question of Asia was left outside of the discussions of peace. And he was particularly concerned about the way in which there was a prejudicial focus on Asia. The prejudicial focus legitimated by this term, yellow peril. So he asks these questions. Who coined the term yellow peril? What was meant by it? And what is the objection to that term? Now, his argument is going to be that if we want an international relations that takes seriously other people in the world, we cannot have a prejudicial attitude to Asia. We have to rethink, this is we in the West, America and Europe, we have to rethink our relationship. So his first move is to suggest we need to stop thinking in terms of the yellow peril and focus on the Asiatic problem. Now, you might not think that's such a big move, and nor do I. But let's look at why he thinks it's a particular move. And I want to quote something from you, from this text. He defined the Asiatic problem as a group of questions and difficulties confronting the peoples of Europe and America due to the adoption by the nations of Asia of the material elements of Occidental civilization and their entry into the life of the world. Now, notice two things about that particular quotation. The Asiatic problem is a problem because it confronts the peoples of Europe and America. And what's confronting the peoples of Europe and America is the way in which Asians are assimilating into Occidental culture. Okay. Now, why is that a problem? And note, this is a problem that he is characterizing as a way, as a problem, as a way of thinking we need to move away from. He gives a number of features of this particular way of treating the Asiatic problem, which he wants to criticize. The first is this idea that the question of migration, Asians migrating into white men's lands. The second is the adoption by Japan and China of Occidental science and technology, which might increase Asia's military influence. You wouldn't think this was 1915, would you? Thirdly, there's what he calls the racial factor, which is characterized by the viewpoint that the Asiatic people, their blood and their brains and their civilizations are inferior to whites. Fourthly, there is the moral factor. He's concerned about the treatment by Europeans and Americans of Asiatics, particularly in America. And finally, there's what he calls the deliberate cultivation of international suspicion through ill will about the Asiatics, through scarce stories of the yellow peril, this notion of invasion, this notion of overturning white Western supremacy and replacing it with Asian supremacy. Now, leaving to one side the fact that all of those factors are racial, not just one of them, what's interesting is the way in which Gulick decides to make a series of proposals about adopting a different kind of approach to the Asiatic problem in terms of international relations. There are three possible responses he suggests, and the first two he discounts to focus on the third one. The first possible response would be to reaffirm white supremacy through military operations and so forth. He discounts that. Second one would be to reaffirm racial segregation throughout the world, and he discounts that one. What he actually settles on, finally, is what he calls the golden rule of internationalism. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He seems to think that these are democratic principles. And he defines this golden rule in the following way. And I need to read this out because this is the point that I want to reflect upon to take us into this notion of raceocracy. This is what he has to say. This policy holds that the precedence of races in intelligence, in political, economic, and social life, and moral and religious insight and attainment, places upon them corresponding moral obligations for right and helpful treatment of nations and races, less privileged, and that further progress of the more advanced races themselves depends closely upon their observances of those obligations. So this is the idea that the more superior or intelligent races have an obligation to help the lesser races. Now, note the difference between that kind of golden rule in terms of race and the very policy options he proscribes: white supremacy, segregation. What is the difference between those kinds of approaches? Now, it seems to me that white supremacy and segregation are characterized by what I call representational markings. It's race as representational force. It's legislative, it's ideological. It's heavily engraved upon people's ideas and their consciousnesses and their bodies. It's marked, it's symbolic, it mobilizes particular kinds of activities. In contrast to that, what Gulick is proposing is a way of regulating the conduct of other populations through placing certain kinds of obligations on those who do the regulating and those who get regulated within a world of international relations where what really counts are our respective comportments to each other. In effect, race as performativity. What I'm trying to contrast here is the way in which race, working through conventional kinds of routines, which actually conceal the emergence of race, but make it normalized, make it commonsensical as simply part of how we interact, as distinct from and in contrast to clearly demarcated, ideologically mobilized ideas of race being projected onto others for whom they can see no kind of particular value or no room for participation and so on. This is the argument that I want to develop. In order to underpin and strengthen his golden rule policy and to proscribe the ways in which traditionally white supremacy, racial segregation have been mobilized as a way of dealing with the Asiatic problem. Remember, it's still a problem. Gulick says this: race domination through force or fraud among peoples is an obnoxious, reprehensible, and really disastrous, as is the domination of whites over other classes within a single nation. Oligarchy, plutocracy, aristocracy, and the like have been repeatedly tested and found deficient. So has raceocracy. So this is the accidental concept. The term raceocracy appears just once in that context, never used again, not even explained. The idea would seem to be that what we've seen so far in the world is an attempt to develop racial rules, an attempt to develop societies constructed around race, raceocracy. For Gulick, raceocracy is unacceptable. It's been tried and been tested and it's failed. I don't know what he's looking at in 1915. But this is what he's saying. But if we look at this concept and the work that it does in his argument, it seems to be not as self-evident as even he thinks it is. It seems to be a certain undecidability, if you like, inhabiting this concept. Because on the one hand, Gulick is making an argument against race as force and representation. But then on the other hand, he's making an argument for race as authority and performativity. And it seems to me that one of the ways in which we can begin to think about this question of race, which is to say the indictment of race, which has traditionally gone under the rubric of racism, is to realize that the very idea of race in terms of its force and its representation has foreclosed these other ways of thinking about race, which is to say, foreclosed them in such a way as to make race as force and representation, once it becomes proscribed, to appear to be the exception against which we ought to inveigh, while what is normalized, what is sustained, what is continued, what is the policy choice of option, is the conventionalized performativity of race. Just to give you a little example of this idea of the performativity of race in a way that seems non-threatening, is simply the fact that we very easily inhabit it. So we tick off our racial categories, we interact with people, oh, that person's in a different race than I am, and it seems all kind of harmless. And we sustain through various kinds of relationships certain kinds of comportments in relation to other races, whether it's working in terms of anti-racism or working against what we call racism. And they pass under the radar. They don't work through written and spoken discourse. They're about how we bring to our relationships particular kinds of comportment. Okay, now this is a difficult part. I want to try and smuggle that kind of idea into some of this discussion around the notion of the state of exception. The reason why I say this is the difficult part, because what I've done up to now is to suggest a different way of thinking about a state of exception, but retrospectively. Let me explain what I mean. Beginning with Carl Schmitt, who for me is far more interesting than a Gambon in these issues, and I'll say why later on. We remind ourselves that the state of exception is organized around a certain notion of decisionism. So the state of exception decides sovereignty because sovereignty is capable of saying what is the state of exception. He who is sovereign is he who can decide the state of exception. And that has a kind of futuristic orientation. You know, it's a decision about what is to become. Now, we know if we look at the work of Schmitt and we look at the work of Gambon and we look at the work of most people who talk about the state of exception, they never tend to think about questions of race or questions of colonialism. It doesn't seem to feature. It does in Schmitt in a particular way, we'll look at that, but never in a Gambon. But if it does feature, it's always going to feature retrospectively. Okay? It's going to be those aspects historically, now that we have available to us the concept of racism, which we would now condemn because we know we inhabit a world, a liberal democratic West, in which race does not occur in such a way that we could talk about a racial state of exception, given that Nazi Germany remains our template. It's the template in Schmitt, it's the template in a Gambon. Okay. But what if, even retrospectively, something strange is happening at that point? So let me walk you through that. Let us say retrospectively, we find that apartheid, Jim Crow segregation, meet all the criteria of a state of exception, and we could call them racial states of exception. And we've got that done. We're clear about that in our heads. But what was going on at the same time in those situations? So let me just give you an example from Jim Crow. Someone who fascinates me is Ida B. Wells, who's an African-American woman in the late 19th century and early 20th century, spent a lot of time investigating lynchings of African Americans. And one of the things she was interested in was the fact of these lynchings. What were they doing politically? In Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, she makes this following observation. From this exposition of race, the race issue in Lynch Law, the whole matter is explained by the well-known opposition growing out of slavery to the progress of race that is crystallized in the oft-repeated slogan, "This is a white man's country and the white man must rule." Now, that's Jim Crow. Why do you have to say, "This is a white man's country and the white man must rule"? You're already ruling. There's nothing bringing that into dispute. Why the lynchings? Now, what's interesting about the lynchings is that they're not written into law. There isn't a manifesto that you can pick up on every street corner saying this is when you lynch and this is how you do it. It takes the merest intimation of some idea of a transgression for the whole performativity of lynching to come into play. It's almost as if lynching is an addendum to democracy. It's not interrupting it. It's almost as if it's completing it. And in carrying out that kind of race governance, in our analysis, retrospectively, that does not meet the criteria of a state of exception. It's almost as if lynching is completing the law, extending it, doing the work it cannot do because it doesn't reach into these kinds of areas. It's this split between representation of race as force and representation of race as authority and performativity that I'm trying to address. So let's go back to Carl Schmitt. The suspension of law takes place in such a way that the constitutional order is interrupted. Now, one thing about this idea of sovereignty that we ought not to do, which Gambon tends to do, but Schmitt tends not to do in the same way, is to treat the state of exception as internal simply to Europe and internal to the West, which is to say, the West devoid of people who don't look like white Europeans and white Americans. And one of the ways in which we avoid treating sovereignty and that conceptualization of sovereignty as internal to Europe and the West is to remember, and Schmitt remembers this, that sovereignty in modernity really concerns European nations, and European nations in a colonial world. To put this another way, one of the things that we need to read and remember, which Gambon doesn't read and doesn't remember, is that the very notion of a state of exception is not simply predicated on decisionism. It's also predicated on territoriality. The context in which the state of exception is decided is never a context of chaos. It's never a context in which there's no order at all. There's residual forms of order. There are excesses of order which will be brought to bear on a situation which already exists. There is a colonial world of order. Or to put this another way, if we read Schmitt closely, there is a nomos, the nomos of the earth. If you look at sovereignty in terms of the context that Schmitt lays out, Schmitt's very clear that from the 16th century onwards, we get a new nomos of the earth, which is the way in which the planet will be governed. And what he means by nomos is this idea that the planet is appropriated, it's divided and distributed, and the results of that division and distribution are managed and utilized. That's what underpins the context in which the law may be suspended and martial rule introduced, or crises or states of emergencies taking place. If we put that in the context of the planet, what we begin to see is that the notion of a state of exception, despite the familiarity of those kinds of instruments and those kinds of techniques in other parts of the world, is simply a way of focusing and sustaining a particular concept of liberal democracy. And that particular concept of liberal democracy specifically excludes its constitution through the colonial management of the planet and the production of race through performativity. Why would this be a particular problem now? Why would this idea of what I'm describing as raceocracy be a particular problem now? It's a particular problem now because it was a particular problem at the point of Reconstruction in America. It's a particular problem now, and it was a particular problem at the point of the post-colonial formation of the world. It's a particular problem because it confronts and exposes this question. How do we, in any notion of that we, sustain race governance, racial inclusion of those who were previously racially proscribed? How do we sustain race governance and racial inclusion? Now, I'm not suggesting anybody's sitting down conspiratorially posing that question, but that question is being posed in many different ways. It's the crisis of multiculturalism, for example. It's the crisis of race around securitization. It features, and let's dwell on this example, in what is known as the new Jim Crow, which is struggling to describe the features of race governance without having recourse to its representational markings because they're no longer available. So it struggles to call it the new Jim Crow. You know, without Jim Crow. But somehow mass incarcerations in the prisons, in the criminal justice system, which is taking place without people saying it should, without people writing it down, without people legislating for it. It's all happening in a performative way. So we're struggling to describe this. And what I'm trying to argue is that the concept of racism doesn't help us get at that, given it's loaded towards ideological analysis. Because we are trying to include racial groups. We don't think they're biologically inferior. Why? We just elected one to be president of the United States the other day. How do we manage race governance with racial inclusion? Now, if you look at the work of Gambon, and I'm trying to edit furiously and quickly, and I just want to give a little nod to him. He's not interested in these kinds of issues, but he is interested in what he calls a new paradigm of government that has emerged. I think I've just described a paradigm of government, but he's not interested in that paradigm. He's interested in a state of exception, the rule of law being suspended from the early 20th century through the First World War, Second World War, 9/11, increasingly becoming the rule. Okay? Those powers are never given up. The rule of law withdraws, less liberties, more direct state control, the impetus of totalitarianism being seen in the democratic lineage. This is his concern. Well, my argument is that what we find working its way through that particular lineage is a way of thinking about race as a state of exception. We now condemn Jim Crow, apartheid, direct forms of systematic racism working through legislation, which at the same time, because we sustain race governance, becomes the racial exception that proves the racial rule. Let me give you another empirical example about this. It's interesting that in a number of European countries, North American countries, a number of warlike metaphors are used to describe what's happening to those countries in terms of race and diversity and ethnicity, which suggest that extraordinary measures need to be taken. It's almost as if these nations experiencing a crisis of multiculturalism are under siege, are being invaded, are experiencing a plague, there's a disease. And even on the other side, where people might mobilize themselves against something called anti-racism, it might be projecting onto an evil. So there's some external thing that comes into the society to which we are exposed, in relation to which we have to do things which might require us to suspend or withdraw some aspects of policy, some aspects of law, and so on. And what I'm trying to suggest is that even in those contexts, we have the performativity of race as governance continuing in a reasonable way. Immigration continues in a reasonable way. Where people live in not formally segregated spaces continues in a reasonable way. We'll even watch Hollywood movies in a non-diverse spectacle every single week in a reasonable way. We'll take those ethnic actors playing particular roles at the behest and within the gaze, the white gaze of the spectacle produced in a reasonable way. All of those elements of race governance are instituted through a certain performativity which creates the conventions in which we sustain and elaborate our particular relationships. So finally, I don't even know why I said finally. I don't even mean finally. I'm just like trying to find somewhere to end. That's the only reason why I said it. So I'm not even going to play on that. What does it mean to think in terms of raceocracy? And I've been trying to explain this in many ways to different people, and I try to think about different ways to work it through. Well, maybe there are two things. One would be to begin thinking about the importance of emphasizing performativity over representation. And let me explain why this is a problem. Today, if you go to court and you want to prove something as racist that's happened, they will say to you, what was said? Was anything said? Was anything written? If nothing was said, say the N-word wasn't used. It's an interesting word, the N-word wasn't used. Nobody ever says it. But if nothing is said, nothing is written, then there's nothing to go on. In effect, nothing's happened. Okay? Now, we know, of course, that there are a lot of things which happen through performance, and through performance which is regimed. We're required to act in particular ways. We need to look at how particular liberal democratic regimes require us to perform race in particular ways, even though nothing is said and nothing is written. And the other implication that I want to leave us with is, what do we do with this concept of racism? If any of the elements of the history that I've given are correct. Because what I'm suggesting the concept of racism did, once it's inaugurated in the 20th century, is to find a way to preserve the quote-unquote purity of liberalism, and then by extension democracy, as regimes, as almost ontological practices which are not imbued or hardwired into colonialism. So in effect, we end up with a way of critiquing racism and race which doesn't require us to say anything in any constitutive way about the colonial, because we're spending, and this is a much longer argument, much more of our time disputing its biological basis, a basis we know doesn't exist. But nevertheless, that's the beginning and the end of our discussion about race. Is it scientized rather than is it facilitated by the colonial? I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question is, are you arguing that racism becomes a problem for Europeans or Americans after World War II, whereas before it wasn't an analytical problem, and that is why Nazi Germany is the template? Am I following you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in a way, you know, there's racism as an empirical description that we have available to us now that it's been conceptualized. So if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, when nobody was using the word racism, people were talking about race prejudice or the color line and so on, okay? Now, if you then ask yourself the question, at what point and in what context does some prescribed object called racism emerge? Well, it emerges in relation to what's happening in Nazi Germany. All of the writers in the 1930s do that. So when they begin to prescribe a particular indictment of race, it carries with it a certain heritage. You know, the scientific aspects are there. You know, well, this is contaminating science. The legislative aspects are there. You know, and then the sense that it is something highly exceptional, you know, to Western, you know, political heritage. You know, Hannah Arendt is a good example of that. You know, this is something really horrific that happens in the excesses of European political rule, not in its constituents. Whereas if you spoke to Ida B. Wells or a W.B. Du Bois, certainly towards the end of his career, you get a different kind of argument, or Frantz Fanon. So that's the argument that I make. Oh, by the way, I'm not precious about any of this, so don't think you're going to hurt my feelings. So, yeah. Please, and then, yeah. Okay, it's Canadian blacklist. It's fantastic.
So, in a nutshell, the problem with racism is that it is too closely associated with ideology and just what people say, rather than the practical effects that it has on people in the world. So as long as someone doesn't say a racial slur while they beat someone up, then it's not racist. You know, like that's the problem. But what if it's just that people are lazy and don't want to like be critical of themselves? Like what if that's the concept of racism is in fact malleable, but people are just choosing not to push it to the limit of the job?
Well, if you're going to say that people are choosing not to push the concept of racism as far as it can go, then we need to know what that concept is. So we need to know what we're pushing. We can't just attribute it to something vague. I need to know if I'm pushing, you know, a pram. Do you call them prams in Canada? Or I'm pushing a van, you know, a baby trolley, right? It's interesting what gets read into it and what doesn't. So, given the condemnation against racism, and given that the Second World War was often mobilized as a war against race, with the closing of the Second World War, none of those victorious peoples are now turning their scorn and their indictment on colonialism. They're not doing it. It's not being turned on Jim Crow. It's not being done. In fact, if you look at one of the things that's always struck me as interesting, the Black Power people, that book by Stokely Carmichael and Charles V. Hamilton, Black Power and the Politics of Liberation in the Americas, published in 1967. If you read the first 3 pages, one of the things they say in that book is that we have this term racism and nobody ever defines it. It's vague. So what they're trying to do in that book is to say, in normal practices like housing allocations, what we have, and they invent this term, is institutional racism. Now, they're saying this in 1967, right? This is not working through some heavily sort of indelible legislation. They're saying this is going under the radar. But then the other thing that they say is that another word or term for institutional racism is colonialism. Very strange analogy to make. Why would you make that there? Something else going under the radar. So it's not simply that things are not written or things are not said. It's that the practices which emerge are seen to emerge from specific ideological practices that seem to have their template in a Nazi Germany. Now, what is interesting about Nazi Germany is that when you analyze their attempted colonization of Europe, they were appealing to and being informed by what was going on with the British in India, Jim Crow legislation. So even the Nazis, just like Carl Schmitt, understand the work of the colonial in these areas. It's just that liberal democratic practice in its reaction to Nazi Germany completely eliminates that colonial formation. And that's what I'm trying to get at. And much of that colonial formation didn't have to have recourse to specific manifestos or specific legislations. It didn't have to do that. Yeah.
I'm probably 3 or 5 steps behind here. I'm just, I take your larger argument about this, but I'm just curious about this issue about the post-World War II Nazi agenda issue, because I think most people don't associate that with racism at all. Because despite what's her name, Bridget's book, When the Jews Became White, that's largely been unproblematic, I think. So that's why I'm surprised by what you're saying here. And I didn't know the proximal history of the use specifically of racism as opposed to these other cognitive terms. But anyhow, I'm just surprised by that.
Well, you say most people, but, there are a lot of associations that can be attributed to the very language that you speak, of which you'll be unaware, why you would formulate particular sentences in particular ways. So those social constraints of which we are unaware, to which sociologists tell us, are the things that I'm trying to address. So you take something like the Declaration of Human Rights. That wasn't written because of colonialism, okay? You may be unaware of that. Other people may be unaware of it. It's written because of what's coming out of Nazi Germany. Even the very discussion about science and race comes out of what's happened in relation to Nazi Germany. So when we begin to forget that, we're operating with a template, and this is what I mean about the convention under which we perform ourselves, which is concealed to us in terms of its emergence. And that's just the way in which Judith Butler talks about performativity. But what's interesting to me is that Nazi Germany is deeply entrenched in a colonial paradigm. And the liberal democratic response to that has been to disavow it. And what's interesting about someone like Carl Schmitt is that he never disavows it because he avows it, right? And he's not a liberal trying to hide and pretend that this doesn't exist. And that's no sort of, I'm not trying to disparage liberals. I'm just keeping it real. I mean, yeah. So you, and then you, and then you.
Okay. Two things you said really stuck out for me. You talked about the futuristic orientation of the state of exception, and then you ended your talk talking about biology becoming the beginning and the end of racism. And I was thinking through the way then that for biology to be the beginning and end of racism in the representational way we're talking about racism requires an idea of the future as well, obviously, right? That race is reproducible, or the nation, the colony is reproducible somehow biologically. So I'm wondering if Raceocracy has if it's a different way of understanding time as well. If there's a temporal sort of shift that you're trying to put forward as well. That this temporal model of race is reproducible gets undermined. If that's something you're thinking through, or if I just have to pick up on that.
Well, it would have a different temporality because it would have to recast the temporality of liberal democracy. You see, one of the things that sort of troubles me in terms of political theory is that people who specialize in liberalism or people who specialize in liberal democracy or social democracy cast it in such a way that it occupies a temporality outside of any kind of real material or discursive relationship to the colonial formation of the world. Now, the idea of raceocracy would suggest that looking at these performances or this performativity, much of which isn't the focus of liberal, democratic, or enlightened thinkers about what to say about race. We have to become a little more reflexive. Let me give you an example. One of the things I really want to problematize, but I haven't done here, is the very idea of race that we inherit from our enlightened heritage. Okay? So we're struggling with this notion that race is hardwired into people. And then our response to that, to criticize it, is to say it's not hardwired into people, but it does exist somewhere. It's just not hardwired into people. I just can't tell you where it exists. Okay? Now, what if race was always constituted as a particular relation of governance in terms of the nomos of the world? So what we're getting as constitutive of race is the way in which Europe organized itself as Europe and organized others as non-Europe and instituted its rule over non-Europe. Now, if that then becomes the constitution of race, biology isn't involved, number one. But what you then get from Enlightenment thinkers onwards is that they take the results of that and focus the results of being governed through a particular relationship as if the bodies that bear that relationship produce the end product of that relationship, naturally or biologically. Now, that suggests a very different kind of temporality, you know? And it means, therefore, that we have this idea of how do we think the historicity of a liberal democratic regime which is constitutive of and constituted by a colonial lineage which produces racist governance. Now, that's again away from what you're talking about, because I don't think about race in the biological way. It has the biological markings because we've tended to conceptualize it that way, just in the same way as that, you know, if I was a prison warder in a prison, I might assume that the prisoners I see, by virtue of being there, bear their criminality within them, rather than as a product of the criminal justice system through which we decide what crimes you commit, where you get to be, and who gets to look after you when you go to bed at night. Am I going off into a strange place there? But right. So, right.
I think I would mean more the way that even utopian sort of anti-racist theories rely on a model of futurity.
Right.
So the next to come will be the better than what is right now. And all of that relies on the idea that race somehow is reproducible, even if non-biological.
Right.
So I was just thinking that what you're doing is actually very different than that, the type of temporal model. And
Yeah.
that fascinates me.
I wouldn't have an answer to that question, which is why I dodged it.
As the sovereign. I mean, I think that that's a really important question about and temporality being not reducible to historicity, but having a more robust sort of set of tenses. And I think that is a really critical problem with anti-racist activism, is this idea that somehow the future will be completely different. And for me, I think one of the problems is that we too often think about race in terms of spatiality and geography, but not enough in terms of its own modes of temporal production and reproduction.
Okay. So, I'm sorry, yes.
I guess my question ultimately is, it seems to me that your problem with the concept of racism isn't so much a problem with the concept of racism, but a problem with the failure of a particular strategy of anti-racism, which accepted the liberal democratic project, right, of inclusion, right, that somehow inclusion of the previously excluded would somehow change systematically the way the world is actually governed. So that's what my question to you is that, thinking of the work of Robert Miles, who has, I think, quite systematically analyzed the concept of racism and distinguished it from other things that weren't actually concepts, but ideas like race. Right. And distinguished it particularly from the paradigm that really kind of ruled, and in many cases still rules sociology, which is the race relations paradigm.
Yes.
Right? So I think Robert Miles actually, with introducing the concept of racialization, did actually make the concept of racism quite precise. Right? Is the process of racialization in place? If it is not, then this is not racism. If it is, then it is. Right? So then we can distinguish between the effects of racism and the for instance, the prison industrial complex in the United States right now. We don't need to abandon the concept of racism to understand something like the prison industrial complex in the United States today, because we can see the process of racialization is embedded within the forms of governance. And we can see most clearly, I think, within the prison industrial complex, the failure of a liberal democratic anti-racism strategy, right? So I think that without talking about the other things that are, part of global governance, in particular, the global operation of capitalism and its expansion, for instance, into the prison industrial complex, so I guess I'm just confused, because what I'm hearing is that, yes, there is a problem with the liberal democratic model of anti-racism so that we can have Obama and still have racism, and somehow we can't explain that. I think we can explain it quite well.
Well, yeah, we can explain it. I thought I had explained it, but let me show you where I think...
I think you are explaining it, but why can it not be explained within the concept of racism, since that seems to be a project of yours?
Great question. Robert Miles actually is one of the people that I have in mind that would want to problematize. So I think the best thing to say is that, I have a problem with the concept of racism, but that's not because it's impossible to do any work with it. You can do work with it, and you can do all the work that you've described. But it seems to me it will hinder us in very particular ways. So let me sort of distinguish my position from Robert Miles. Robert Miles, in his clarification of racism, is very clear and very precise. Racism is ideology. Okay? Then the next move after that is ideology is distorted consciousness. Okay? So, you know, ideology, because the object then becomes to critique ideology, which enables us to mystify social relations in terms of this thing called race. And that's the way you go. That's the particular sort of Marxist legacy he has of ideology. Okay, but what if race has a materiality? Okay, which is to say that it is material as class is material. If you could show the constitution of particular social relations as race that don't work through but are worked upon by ideology. Now that's where I would differ from Robert Miles, because his way of resolving this would be to say, well, clearly race is ideological. There's a way of trying to construct other peoples as if they are less than or inferior, which mystifies, shall we say, their class differences. And we can see the ways in which those kinds of attributions to particular kinds of populations blunt the capacity for a certain kind of political action against an unjust economic system. I don't think Robert Miles has departed from, I mean, it might be a caricature, but departed from that sort of project forever. I'm not saying he should depart. But what if race is a materiality? Now, what's always interested me, and this is the argument that I make in my work, is, you know, that race is assembled from a lot of different materials. And in that assemblage of race, it's that assemblage of race that gets to be biologized. Now, the way I like to make the argument, and it seems to me this is why the colonial field is very important, is that how and when do we seem to ontologize this idea that something called Europe exists naturally and non-Europe exists naturally? How does that ever happen? And it's the colonial work that creates this capacity to think that there are climates and there are bodies and there are histories and there are religions and there are languages and there are dispositions that can be allocated to something called Europeanness and others that can be allocated to something called non-Europeanness. Now, those allocations are materially engraved upon all of those things I've just mentioned. They're organized, they're planetarily organized in that way. And it seems to me that when you look at that, every single racial category we've ever come across breaks down on that fault line. Whenever you see white, black, red, yellow, or whatever it is, one of those categories created the rest, the white category. But it didn't just do that ideologically. It didn't just do it discursively. It did that in the hard ground work, the Spanish in the Americas to begin with. So there's a point at which that's not getting called race. It's getting constituted as race and then codified in a very different way, which runs counter to its constitution. So that's why the Enlightenment thinkers like Kant, they don't think about, oh, we've colonized the world and we've created these material categories. They just deal with the results. And that's the heritage. Now, part of what feeds in, from my point of view, into anti-racism, which creates, it's the anti-race that creates racism. It's being against race in a particular way that creates the object of racism, if we look at it in the early 20th century, is that it draws upon that Enlightenment heritage. And so do Marxists, like Robert Miles. It's not just the liberal democrats. They have no other way of thinking about it. So that would be the difference between someone like a Miles and me. I'm not so sure that thinking about race in terms of ideological practice gets us to where we want to go, because otherwise it suggests that, you know, you just get a better ideology, you know, just clean it up a little bit, and then we'll preserve these institutions, like the notion of the West, for example. Have you ever noticed that the West itself as a category seems to have a certain purity about it, which is to say, there are not supposed to be non-Europeans in the West, but they're always there. It's like the West is constituted always outside of the relation of the colonial relation. The modern idea of the West has always had the colonial relation marking it, which seems to me to suggest you could never reduce the West to its European component. It always contains as a relation a non-European component that it's ruling. There's nowhere in the world called a non-West. The non-West doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. But the West as a particular project exists. It's not a place. You know, it's a geography wherever it goes, wherever it takes that relation. And what I'm trying to get at is the materialization of these particular categories that we simply think are ideological. Sorry. Yeah. You know, it looks like I did that to get away from you, but I will come back, because I was like, am I having a hard time here? But
yeah. No, I'm just really interested in your conversation. I'm sort of putting my hand up as well. It's sort of coming towards my question.
Right.
My question actually was, I mean, to start with, I really enjoyed your talk, and it reminds me of a book I read about 2 weeks ago, which is Chatterjee's Black Hole Vampire, which actually makes precisely a similar parallel point about empire as a state of and the ability to declare state of exception, rather than being some kind of regime of truth. But Chatterjee takes it a different way, and I thought it was interesting, sort of, especially when you talk about the West, I was interested in trying to think of this. Chatterjee will also sort of say, well, if we think about the most of the world is not the West. And so, if we're thinking about these questions coming back to liberal democracy and coming about these questions of race coming back to the issue of liberal democracy, it may well be for most of the world that the question of liberal democracy is actually asked in a very different kind of way.
yes.
And so, what I was interested in, and I know you weren't saying that the non-West does not exist, but conceptually in a certain way, of course, the non-West does not exist. And yet the non-West is coming into being. Economic changes in the world. I mean, the 7 areas that were considered the non-West now have become communists. Now, what's happening in these regimes is there's a very different sense in which race is used, because what happened is, of course, these were the colonies. These were the places where that at the previous time were the state of exception. And so what's happening in many of these places, you think China, which I guess is Stalinism if you go back to it, if you look at regimes of race in India, Malaysia, Singapore, Fiji, you get a situation which is very different than one you described, which is one actually in which race is always there, and race is never taken away, and race is actually part of governance. So race is certainly not part of the state of exception. And I'm just wondering how, what you're doing in a very interesting way, how it would then take into this experience of, how it would bring in this experience of most of the world into it, maybe a larger theory of performativity and representation in terms of race.
Okay. I don't know if what I'm about to say is controversial or not. I hope it isn't. I hope everything I've said before now is controversial. Not this part, but... So I tend to see race differently. I see race as a modern category, and I don't see race as a category that one can find in other places outside of the influence of the Western colonial project. So that then gets me into some kind of discussion, which is to say, well, if we were to say that there are indigenous notions of race in India or Africa, so what is the concept of race we're using at that point? And it seems to me that one of the things that's taken place in the late 20th century is that the particular conceptualization of race in its biological form, which is inaugurated by the modern project, has now been found in other places. Now, I don't know what that does with certain kinds of categories like ethnicization, but one of the things that persuades me to hold on to the idea of race as a modern category is that it seems to be imbued with the capacity, almost from the day it's born, to globalize itself and impose itself on other kinds of cultures and other kinds of formations. So you see the Japanese in the late 19th century, particularly as they attempt to enter the space of international relations, buying into Western racial categories, wanting to occupy, if you look at the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles and the whole discussion around the League of Nations, wanting to occupy the position of honorary whites if they possibly could, so that they could be a major player at the table. So the first part of the answer to your question is that I don't sort of accept the idea of this, the promiscuity of race in that kind of way, if I can misuse a biological metaphor, because it does seem to me that the Western category globalizes itself in such a way that every other attempt to use some notion of absolutism is intensely localized and never globalizes itself. So I'm focusing on that. I think I've answered the question. I was trying to think of if there was another part. So that would be the difference. And I think in Chatterjee's work that he doesn't really have a robust concept of race. And that would be my concern. It's almost as if these things tend to pass for descriptions of particular ethnic groups, the malignment of particular people formations, whereas I'm casting it in a wider sense, in a sense that even some of these Enlightenment thinkers, when you look at their original categories of race, they're describing climate, they're describing language, they're describing disposition. We know the colonial project gets us to describe labor. So, oh, well, I don't know. I just felt you encroaching. That's all.
Well, thank you very much.